at this point, we have, we're changing the schedule slightly. So we have on, I guess, Google Hangout hookup or something like that. One of those computer-generated hookups. We have Dennis and Lynn Speed, who have been leading the work in New York, which is the main area of our present activity in the United States, or at least the exemplary area. That will be followed, and these are limited in time, we're just going to give you a taste of it, by Leona on the science driver. So let me just turn it over to Dennis and Lynn.
Okay, we're starting. Dennis? Yeah, we're ready. Give 5 seconds.
All right, fine. No, no.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Good.
All right, you guys are on.
We can't see you.
All right.
Okay, here we go.
All right, start.
With the shadow now. Okay.
Lay it on, getting ready?
Hey.
You ready to start? Can you hear me, Dennis? Can you hear me? Leona, can you hear me? All right, can we get Dennis to start? Yeah.
You were able to hear me, and I hope that that's true. But I also heard Phil say that he was expecting Dennis and Lynn Speed. So, bam! There's Lynn Speed waving. Okay, so we are both here, and I guess we're supposed to say something about what you've been called. Well, let me just say a couple things. We had today a what's called a sing-along. It's called that, but we had about 110 people approximately at a church, All Souls Church in the city here. Now, the reason we called it, and it was not a concert performance, but it was participatory, was because, as you know, there have been all these incidents around the country, whether it was Ferguson, Missouri incident, or the Trayvon Martin from earlier in Florida, or the Eric Garner incident here in Staten Island. And a lot of people are saying a lot of things about all of these, but the fundamental problem is that the causes, the true causes for these forms of social unrest are being ignored. Our job, of course, is to bring that into focus. There is a policy, a plan, to eliminate 6 billion people on the planet, and that includes a lot of Americans. The police, who are being castigated for their behavior in this regard, are not rich. The victims are not rich. If you look at the area at Ferguson, Missouri, this is a deindustrialized area, once a center of American production. And one thing I'd like to just point out is that in 2010, 4 years ago, the Chinese had a plan to actually expand the St. Louis International Airport, and we're in discussion and negotiation with the city of St. Louis to engage in a massive expansion, industrial expansion of that area. Unfortunately, many bankers from the city of London were also involved in that enterprise. And as a result, the policies that, for example, LaRouche, familiar with, been hearing some of it already, aren't what informed that effort. In Ferguson, Missouri, which is basically essentially a suburb of St. Louis, you have the Mississippi River that separates St. Louis on the one side and East St. Louis on the other. There's about 100,000 people in that area. right now, primarily African American, who are employable and are not employed. The unemployment rate among those under 26 is now 75%. And so when you consider that the Chinese government 4 years ago was offering to be involved in that location, and that was not carried out because of the problem that we know exists in the White House, what we know exists in the form of the Cheney-Bush administration prior to that every instance of unrest in our nation today can actually be laid at the feet of the Obama and Bush-Cheney travesty. The Manhattan Project is merely a way, essentially, of taking Lyndon LaRouche's ideas and his policies of what has been actually well over 40 years as exhibited in New York City. Because remember that Lyndon LaRouche said he started his he gave a series of classes at the New School of Social Research back in 1966. And during the period of the student unrest, 1967-68, was invited up to Columbia University, where he founded what was called the National Caucus of SDS labor committees. It was a labor committee within the student movement of SDS, intended to prevent what was then a potential racial confrontation in the city of New York, which was basically occurring around Columbia University's attempt to put a gymnasium in the middle of Morningside Park in Harlem. And whereas there were a lot of agitators and what we used to call back then proto-fascist elements in the student movement in SDS, LaRouche intervened saying students have only one interest, and that is not student interest. The interest is how can the United States as a whole adopt economic and social policies opposite to this deindustrialization and the destruction of the country that we saw in the Vietnam War, and that they should seek to make alliances with the working class, as we called it, employed and unemployed and many others. But there was one United States which had to be unified, and that single United States in unity could solve the problems confronting the country. So what I want to do is, as best we might do it in a few minutes, is to just try to stick to the way that I understand that Lynn is defining the project, because he's the one that defined the Manhattan Project. Helga LaRouche, through her initiative with the Schiller Institute conferences, starting January 2013, catalyzed the entire process. That from the point at which Helga made it very clear to us that she wanted not merely that there be a Schiller Institute intervention, but that there be an outreach, an intervention that caused us to grab those institutions in the United States by the throat, that we needed to grab by the throat and bring them into compliance and into agreement with the conceptions of economics that Lynn had been promulgating and had now been adopted finally by over half of the world. And so what we'll just do is use a few slides to kind of prompt the presentation, keeping it relatively efficient on the single point that Lynn has been driving home. And so if we could go to some of those slides, then I think we might proceed best. So let me know when you've got the first one up.
We have the first one up. Can you hear it? We have the first one up.
So,
Dennis, can you hear me? Hello? Hello?
You have to unmute that microphone on the screen. That's it.
Yeah, do you have the first slide up? Yeah, that's fine. Keep going.
Exactly. That's Alexander Hamilton, who at the age of 1773, joined the Patriot Corps. He was he commanded an artillery brigade. He was at most of the major battles of the American Revolution, including the crossing of the Delaware at Trenton, and including, at the end of the war, at Yorktown, where he got a chance to actually lead a brigade together with Lafayette, which brigades were important in the final defeat of Cornwallis. So Hamilton, the person that became the first treasurer of the United States, at the recommendation, by the way, of his friend Robert Morris, who Washington had first selected for that position, but it was Morris who told Washington, if you really want to know who understands the economy better than anybody in the nation, it's Alexander Hamilton. He wrote 4 reports starting in 1790, and last week, on December 13th, we were commemorating, through our BRICS conference, his writing of his report on the National Bank. The point of the bank is that the bank was merely one way to actually consolidate the single constitutional unity of the country. It should be pointed out that New York State was not, shall we say, really enthusiastic about the Constitution. In fact, the Constitutional Convention, which was spearheaded of the Constitution by John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and Gouverneur Morris, only ratified the Constitution of the United States by 3 votes. And that was actually after Virginia had ratified. And what was important was that it was Hamilton's faction in New York that insisted that a singular, sovereign United States would not be worth a continental unless it had a national bank, it had the ability to issue credit on behalf of the nation as a whole, and unless all of the debts of the colonies were paid singly by a sovereign nation which was also capable of initiating public improvements by issuing credit for those improvements and standing behind that credit. Hamilton did many things, but it's important to understand that his actions were anti-colonial and he created, for the first time in history, in the sense of an entire nation. We had done something like that in Massachusetts earlier with the pine tree shilling. But for an entire nation, Hamilton established for the first time an anti-colonial, anti-monarchical form of finance. This was not original with Hamilton entirely. He had learned much of it from Ben Franklin, who, as did Hamilton in 1729, when he was 23 years old, had written his famous essay on paper currency. And of course, Gottfried Leibniz, at the age of 26, had written his essay, Society and Economy. And so when you look at these men, and you look at these people who are the true founders of the United States, often in their early 20s, they had the formulations and policy outlook that would then inform what and the swindle mentioned everyone, including council, how to use a fund that was created to figure out a way to get fresh water into New York. But what happened, you just used the money at Hamilton's bank. Hamilton's assassination in 1804 robbed us of one of the most important Americans in our history. Let's go to the next slide. What I'd just like to point out in general about what we're talking about here today is a set of policies in America that, and this shows you where the first inauguration of the first president of the United States, George Washington. Hamilton's office was right down the street from there, and that's what he wrote the report on manufacturers, the report on public credit, and other such reports. Next. Your next slide shows you Helga LaRouche in New York with Ramsey Clark in June. Clark being the former Attorney General of the United States, been doing New York and Hamilton's revolutionary role and revolutionary economics, and the role of Lyndon LaRouche's revolutionary economics, and combining them. And what we're trying to show is that the beginning of the country and the present day are singular idea represented by singular literal text of what we are talking about today. This is just a shot of her presentation in June with Ramsey Clark at that time. Clark, as some of you know, acted as a defense counsel for Lyndon LaRouche, and that was despite the fact that over the years we had great criticisms of Ramsey Clark. He represents the kind of alliance in America that we have to forge right now. That there are disagreements that people may have had in the past, and they may have them now, but that the idea of creating a patriotic faction that actually changes the country on behalf of the actual Constitution, that trumps any differences. And Attorney General Clark's presence at our meetings has more than symbolized that. It's actually concretized that new way of acting in America. Next. Abraham Lincoln talked about when he was 15 years old, in 1824, that he wanted to become the DeWitt Clinton of Illinois. DeWitt Clinton, who was governor, also mayor of New York, created the Erie Canal, he finished the Erie Canal project, a project that was actually started by Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law, Philip Schuyler. Schuyler attempted to do and it was his failure to do that in part prompted Hamilton to insist that the federal government of the United States had not only the right but the responsibility to initiate internal improvements for the people of the United States. Now, this is important because you'll hear a lot of people talk about Hamilton's imperial designs. You'll talk about the unconstitutionality of having a national bank. Not only is a national bank necessarily constitutional, without a national bank, you don't have a United States, which is sovereign. And Hamilton recognized that because he recognized that, taking, for example, today, the new economic platform that we have to build throughout the Americas would require federal credit issued by a national bank, a reformed Federal Reserve, a completely Federal Reserve, has to be the core initiating means or catalyst for everything else that's going to happen. And Lincoln had that idea in 1824 at the age of 15 from seeing how the Erie Canal was able to unify the eastern part of the country and the Middle West in particular. And implicitly, Lincoln's support for the Transcontinental Railroad was effectively simply an extension that internal improvements were the responsibility of the American government in the form of what we call the American system. Next. The Statue of Liberty, given to the United States in the 1870s, is one controversy around that statue you may not know, but the feet originally, there were people that were objecting to that in the originals because they said the fact that the Statue of Liberty was black, and therefore it'd be better to make sure that that feature was not included. It's important to recognize this about America in terms of issue of so-called about this. But Martin Luther King and others made it very, very clear what they thought and what King's idea about this was well contained in some remarks that we use today. We had this Handel sing-along, and just to say about that, I used the occasion to quote something from Martin Luther King that he said, and this was in a talk he gave at the age of 24. It's called What is a Man? And and compose it. He can think of a great civilization and produce it. He can be a Handel moving into the highest heavens and transcribing the glad thunder and gentle sighing of the great Messiah. By his ability to reason, his power and memory, and his gift of imagination, man transcends time and space. As marvelous as are the stars, as great as is Messiah, man that studies them. And so it's important, I think, just to say that times of foolish strife and diversion, when we could be adopting the measures that we have to adopt, as you've already been. Am I back up?
Yeah, you're up. Can you hear us?
Can you hear me? Okay. Okay, great. I'm sorry. I guess we got lost there. Well, as happens. All right. You're able to hear me now. Is that right, Eric? Is that what your thumbs up meant?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay. So, that's Franklin Roosevelt. I hope that you're seeing now. And we're nearly at the end here. Franklin Roosevelt was governor of New York before he became the president of the United States. Roosevelt, but I think in terms of our narrative today, his great ancestor, Isaac Roosevelt, was a close collaborator of Alexander Hamilton and a co-founder with Hamilton of the Bank of New York. So this policy of utilizing public credit and the national sovereignty of the United States to improve the lot of the citizens is what Franklin Roosevelt meant by the New Deal. This was not a welfare program. This was a program in defense of the general welfare of the people of the United States. And so, attempted and succeeded in doing, particularly things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, were informed by Roosevelt's study at the age of 18 of Roosevelt and his writings about that. Now, that doesn't mean that everything that Roosevelt was doing was ingeniously crafted in the way that Alexander Hamilton's economics was. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that he had a clarity of mind and purpose about the nature of the American system, and he understood who his enemies were. He understood that his enemies were the same as Alexander Hamilton's enemies. His enemies were the Aaron Burrs of such as the Morgans who attempted a coup against Roosevelt in 1934. I think that's important just to think about his instinct and the idea that Roosevelt was called a traitor to his class. Next picture. We should be seeing there the Kennedy brothers, John and Robert Kennedy. I'm not going to take a lot of time to really talk about them. I think you're well aware that our whole point is that from the time of the Kennedys on down the drain, the important thing to know is that Robert Kennedy became a senator from New York in '64. He left the Attorney General's position. He actually never went back to the office after the assassination of his brother. He didn't go back for a 2-month period. And then after some altercations with Lyndon Johnson, he left, became a senator from New York, and it was from that position that President of the United States. I think we just go to the next slide. And this is Lyndon LaRouche in the debate with Abba Lerner, which happened in the period right after the United States dollar was taken off the gold standard. This picture is who just has the role in the United States and in New York that he has. I first met Leni in December of 1970, earlier, but I had not met him. There were only a couple of chapters, about 5 chapters, I believe, of his economics textbook that were printed at that time. And I remember going to Columbia University for a conference of about 400 people, maybe 500 people. And the conference was splitting in two. In fact, more than splitting. And so it's a great debate going on at that moment about whether or not the students should just go into the ecology movement, the early environmental, and try to the students in the environmentalist movement, or whether the students should get out of that, leave the campuses, and organize real people. And was making the point that as of, this was before 1971, when I met him, it was December of 1970, so it was 9 months before that. And what's important, I think, to say is that he was saying very forcefully there that the Bretton Woods system that had been created through FDR's efforts, not through John Maynard Keynes' efforts, that system had failed, that we were already going to see its collapse, and that something had to be done to alert the American people and to organize the American people as a whole. And so what happened was, I'm there, I watched half the organization, and I had a chance to talk to him in the break. It was at something like 1:10 in the afternoon. And I remember it because we talked until about 1:45. And I asked him every question I could think of about everything I knew. And it was all gone in 45 minutes. And he was just there, and everybody was running around debating generally on all kinds of things. And I just said, I can't think of anything else to ask, which I was very shocked by. He just said, okay, well, fine, if you have another question, just ask me. Now I say this because his presentation had shot the hell out of, and 9 months later, both saying in that presentation would be proven right. And the people that left the room that day and were not with him from that time drifted in various parts of life that I don't want to even take the time now to talk about. We don't have to. The importance of the idea of Manhattan, the importance of the idea of Hamilton in Manhattan, Project Leni. I think he wants us to do what he did. He wants us to do what Hamilton did, but he wants us to do it the way he did it. And what I think that means in conclusion is what you see Phil there doing and others of the organization, what we did in our recruitment of young people some 10 years ago, what we're involved in right now with our campaign around the BRICS conference. We speak truth not only to power, we speak truth to so-called powerlessness. The American people believe themselves to be powerless. That is not true. And is our speaking the truth to that and causing them to know they can make BRICS. Hamilton, as a citizen, created America. That's what our mission is, and that's what Leni is doing even now, 50 years later. We thank you and hope that that tells you something about what we're trying to do in Manhattan.
Despite all the technical problems, some of that got through because I think it was an important representation of what we're up to and some of the real background of all this New York project and Manhattan project. Now what we're going to do is go to Leona. From the infamous basement, you're going to find out what goes on in the basement. They're not really putting together a Frankenstein. They're going to tell you what real scientists do, I hope. All right?
Okay, hold on, I'm gonna put you here.
Okay, can I be heard? Okay. Okay, hi. For those of you who don't know me, I work with a small team directly with Mr. LaRouche, Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, which was pulled together to maintain or to develop some fundamental scientific questions with regard to human economy. So, what I want to cover today is something that is along the same arc that we've been developing from a slightly different standpoint. And specifically, I want to develop for people what Mr. LaRouche sees right now in this whole BRICS development. And, you know, there are a lot of exciting things that are happening, and people have developed it, lots of construction, lots of activity that really has not been happening for the past several decades anywhere. But Mr. LaRouche actually sees something much bigger than even the people who are directly involved in this whole process. And it actually comes out in a specific focus on China's space program. And if you think about this, there are a lot of things to focus on, including, for example, the International Development Bank that the BRICS agreed on. This is very big. Mr. LaRouche has been working on the idea of a new International Development Bank for decades, 40 years. The land bridge, the new Silk Road that has been initiated, which is again, Helga and Lyndon LaRouche have been building for many, many decades. And yet, there is a strong focus from Mr. LaRouche on specifically the lunar program of China. And I think for people in the United States, there's all sorts of weird media, I guess you could say, press. And, you know, you get all these funny things that are, well, what they're doing is still not where we were, and all these very static statements. And I just want to read something from Mr. LaRouche himself. Okay, so he says, in this new arrangement, the BRICS arrangement, we're going to have to come to a new arrangement in which we have a new conception of what national sovereignty is. Because we're going to find out that the idea of what a human being is, as opposed to an animal, which is not clear generally yet, is going to change. What China is doing, especially with the space program, is going to change the way we define the meaning of mankind. I think that's actually something that's bigger than most people think is going on right now. Few people have defined that the current development that is occurring, this new era, is actually a redefinition of what mankind is as a species. And this whole new paradigm idea, I think, has to be has to be much more profound in the sense of, has to be much profound as in depth, as in essentials, as in an overturn of the basic fundamental basis of the way that society functions. And this is really what Mr. LaRouche is now seeing in the BRICS. So he's not seeing a community of nations that are coming together to do good things and are saying good things. That's not what he's seeing right now. He's actually seeing a motion toward a fundamental shift in the way human beings function, the way that human beings define human beings. And if, in the sense that if you were to start to define human beings as a species, like you do an elephant or a mouse or something, it would, what comes out of this process, if we do it right, will qualify as a new species. We'll have different properties and have different power. And I'll get to what I mean by that in a second. Just saying, look, this new paradigm is going to have to be a major discovery. And it hasn't been made yet. In some sense it has, but the discovery that is going to really push us into a new paradigm it hasn't been made yet. And he said it a couple times where this question of what type of government is ideal came up. So, and he said, look, the way you deal with governments, for example, a governmental system, is not funds from here and there, American system in some way, and so on, and combine them to make what would be an ideal system. He's saying, no, maybe we have to go about something like that, for example, something like organized society is going to be top down. All the nations. And, you know, that notion. The United States was based on a principle that was a scientific discovery about what mankind is, such that you could say, we're going to base a system on developing mankind's creativity, not as bird, but as creative, and it's going to work. It's going to work in systems prior. American system was not a conglomerated system. And that's probably the most recent that is comparable. And now, what we're seeing is a major potential to make that type of discovery now, today. And really, that is what we're seeing, these two crossroads coming together, defining. So the crossroads are the collapse pre-system of the old paradigm of what we've been living through. And a very tumultuous period where those two are coming together. And you know, you see things in the news, you see it actually came of oil prices, right? So oil prices dropped, and immediately press has the two different sides. One side is, okay, it's an attack on the US natural gas industry. And the other side says, no, it's a real attack on Russia. And the two sides come from different standpoints of how you're looking at the world. Now, to get a better sense of what I'm saying about this idea of mankind, I want to bring in Johannes Kepler. So some of you have been working on Kepler's new astronomy. And for those of you who haven't, I'm not going to be able to go through it all right now, but I can give you a basic sense of what he intended to do with his new astronomy. Most people have heard of Kepler as, if you've ever heard of Kepler, you've heard him in an astronomy class, or a physics class, or something comparable. So, are you guys still on?
Yes, we are. Yeah? Go ahead.
Okay. So I just want to go back a little bit. Oh.
Sorry, I'll put it on mute. Go ahead.
Okay. So I just want to go back a little bit to 400 years ago, to Johannes Kepler. And I think it's very important. It's funny because some of these people, some of these great scientists who define whole eras are not even either not known or known as sort of a hobby. But Johannes Kepler created modern science in the sense of modern physical science. What I mean by physical is prior to Johannes, early 1600s, there really was not an idea that physical things are physically active. And what I mean by, in the sense that, for example, people thought that the planet moved in geometric figures, but did not have this idea, for example, that anything was pulling on anything or pushing on anything or things like that. And Johannes Kepler was the first to actually hypothesize that big flaming ball in the sky might actually be doing something. Might actually be directly connected to the motion of the Earth, of the other planets, and so on. And there were astronomers before that. I mean, Copernicus was before him, and so on. But that was not a hypothesis. There were hypotheses of where to put things, but not a hypothesis that the sun itself actually moved things. And he made this profound discovery from the standpoint of a very, people would call it a religious hypothesis. So, he made this discovery of the sun moving things by doing two things. One, he took human understanding of geometry and married it with human understanding of harmony. And together with those two, so musical harmony and geometry, those two together, he was able to put together a system which was able to then put the entire solar system as they knew it into one harmonic system. In other words, he would be able, for example, to forecast where a planet should be. Now, this was very big, because, I mean, think about this. There's all sorts of ideas now, for example, that human music, for example, is culturally important. It's just something that you like, and you may like it and other people may not like it. Now, he didn't treat it that way, because of course, there's not many solar systems that we live in. Well, that may be different, but he treated it as something that had to be universal, such that we would recognize harmony. And that if that thing was universal, then it should be expressed everywhere. And it should be expressed in human thought. Now, he was able to prove this. It's funny because he's known for his astronomical discoveries, but his astronomical discoveries are somewhat secondary to his ultimate hypothesis, which is that human beings, though you live in a body, you live on one planet, and you at that time have not gone to any planet at all, you could come to know in your mind the ordering of the entire solar system. You could know how to reason out how the solar system was built. And his ultimate proof then was of that universality of the human mind. Now, you may know, if you've ever taken, really, not even just astronomy, but any science, that idea that it's just a no-no right now, today. The idea that you make a discovery of the human mind would be the basis of scientific revolution is not taught today, and it's almost not allowed to be taught. And that has a lot of implications. I want to bring in a figure named Vladimir Bernatsky, who's a little bit more recent, from just prior to the World War. He lived through World War I and World War II. And he pointed this specific paradox out. He says, look, right now we have a very, very big paradox. And the paradox really started to gel around this early 1900s period. But it started from right past Kepler and specifically from Newton. So he said, look, as we make more and more discoveries about galaxies, about stars, and we look further and further away, it seems that human beings are becoming smaller and smaller. The planet is only a part of a solar system. The human being and the continents are only part of a planet, and human beings are a very, very small part of that planet. And therefore, human beings are a very, very, very small part of the entire solar system, and not to mention the galaxy. And so, therefore, we are insignificant. And that argument itself was what he took problems with. And now, before I go on to what he says should be the view, think about how that view, which is technically a scientific view, scientific model, affects society overall. What does that mean? And one of the examples you may think of for example, is the whole greening movement, the whole environmentalist movement, and what it's based on now, especially. This idea that human beings cannot come to govern. Whatever humans do, humans are going to mess everything up. Because you cannot come to scientifically know how things really work. And in fact, you shouldn't change anything. Because you should change anything because you are insignificant. And Bernatsky says, look, this philosophy of mankind is not only wrong, but it's destructive. And that the real paradigm shift will be that human thought, which actually is physically significant in the sense that human thought changes things, has to then, I mean, it does exist, human thought exists. And therefore, if you're going to have a universal, if you're going to say you have universal laws, it must include human thought. Now, human thought has all these different properties which are not taken into any consideration usually, like, for example, creativity. The ability to change fundamentally the way everything works, the way not only to change everything, but to make a discovery about universal laws, things that govern the universe. So, now I want to come back. This is all cursory, I'm sorry, but I want to come back to China's space program. Because the China's space program is actually pretty amazing. The moon program started in 2007. So 2007, in 2013, end of 2013, they landed a rover on the moon. And this is the first time that something has soft landed on the moon for 37 years. It landed on the moon, has been able to take the first pictures of the entire plasmasphere of the Earth, has been able to take a picture of the Earth from that far for the first time since the Apollo missions. And China's already talking about going to the moon, going to Mars. It's very explicit about inhabiting the moon and inhabiting Mars, not just going there for exploration purposes. And it really is the type of activity that is in this vein of discovery of a more powerful, more universal mankind. And that's the type of discovery that then reshapes everything else. Reshapes how you finance things, how you make collaborative deals with people, how you make treaties, and so on. Besides making a major fundamental revolution in science and arts. And told that I've run out of time. So I'll stop there. Maybe we can take some things up in questions.
Okay, well, we have to apologize. Apparently the internet connection here, as you've noted, is not too good. And we were not completely aware of that. So hopefully people got something, because the topics that you were discussing is critical to our understanding of, as they say, the way forward, as was Dennis's. But I want to ask Mr. Alexandra Peronel from the Congress of Russian Americans in Southern California to say a few words given the situation.
Hello. I don't know if you're aware that the Congress of Russian Americans was created in the early 70s. I myself am half Russian, half French. I've been in the United States since the late 50s. I've been educated in this country. It was created in the early 70s because at that time there was a confusion. People were referring to Russians as Soviets, as communists, and there's a big Russian community all over the world, including in this country, that brought great things to this country, such as Rachmaninov, Sikorsky, and others, who are Russians. They were not communists. They ran away from communism, on the contrary. So we fought Russophobia, and also we fought for equal rights, human rights in the Soviet Union. And now, of course, since the fall of the Soviet Russia, as I call it, not the Soviet Union, because Russia existed before the Soviet Union, and its borders were quite the same as they are now. So now we fight basically still against Russophobia, which exists in this country, and we also help different communities in Russia with medical help. We bring in children sometimes to be operated in this country, or vice versa. We send doctors to operate people who are in need over there. The reason I asked to speak, basically, I traveled to Russia quite extensively. As a matter of fact, next week I'm leaving to Russia again for 3 weeks to spend Russian Christmas there and New Year's and etc. I'm working on a couple of projects over there. And I'm speaking on my behalf, not as third parts of the Russian-American Congress. I feel Russian, I feel French, I've had ties to America, of course. I feel like almost like a bridge. So I'm quite emotional, I'm hot-tempered, but I'm very pro-Putin. You know, everybody says he's an ex-KGB. Well, Papa Bush was an ex-FBI and CIA guy. So that's my argument about that. However, I was very saddened to see the turn what's happening in America with the news media and what's happening in Washington, D.C. It's quite disturbing to me because as a strong anti-communist, I was happy to see, of course, the fall of communism, but I didn't see such disintegration of basically of a country, which is tied historically. Imagine the railroads of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Siberia, the Ukraine. Kiev is the birth of Russian Christianity. Sevastopol, or the Crimea, my great-great-uncle lost a leg fighting in the Crimea. So when I see brother countries, or new countries, if I call them, because my mother was born in Ukraine, where influence, outside influence, is creating antagonism. It's happening in our community here in the United States. Now you have families that are fighting, some of them are pro, as we call it, Red Revolution and Maidan, and it's sad to see. What is sad to see is that the government of the United States, our people in Washington, have such a strong anti-Russian approach. People don't understand. Russians have a strong character. They survived a terrible revolution. They survived the antagonism, the prosecution of Stalinism, collectivization. Solzhenitsyn wrote and tried to put together how many people died under the Soviet system. Unfortunately, including World War II and the collectivization, the famine that happened in Ukraine, we're not too far from about 100 million people. I don't understand, and I read a lot of different things. I read CNN, I don't watch anymore, it's boring. Reuters is basically the same news. I had actually a discussion with a friend of mine who's a journalist in Paris not too long ago, and we discussed, Reuters basically, he said, well, journalism doesn't exist anymore because it's too expensive to send a journalist all over the world. So now we get all our information from Reuters. That's why when you read the LA Times, or whichever, Washington Post, the news resembles it all. So I try to read other things and watch other television. I watch French television, I watch RT, which is Russia Today, which not everything is perfect there too, I must admit, okay? But you have to watch different things to at least have an idea what's going on in the world. And so I just thought I'd bring this to your attention. If you have some questions to see how people feel in Russia today, Russians feel very sad that there is such antagonism was created in Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia. They don't understand why America is behaving this way, even though Russians like Americans, they love American literature, they don't like the government. So if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them briefly for you if, and that's all I basically have to say. Yes, sir.
Oh, I'd just like to say that my mother was born in Odessa,
Okay.
and so I am, have been in all my life in complete sympathy with Russian people, and I've always felt that the Soviet Union was one more Russian formation. They had the Tsars, and they had the Soviet Union, and now that's gone. But it was Russia the whole time, is all I'm saying. And I understand exactly what's going on in the Ukraine, that NATO has engendered a civil war, basically, between certain people, fascist-type Russophobes in western Ukraine against the Russians who are in eastern and southern Ukraine. And what do you think? Oh, I'd like to say one or two other things. If you're looking for some alternate sources of information, I would recommend, besides the LaRouche pack, of course, I would recommend Russia Insider. If you get on the
No, I don't.
you don't know Russian Insider?
No, I don't.
Check it out on the web sometime. It's got the best analysis by Russian political scientists in there, and very interesting discussion. Well, have you heard of the Saker, the Vineyard of the Saker?
No.
Okay, look him up.
You'll give them to me, I'll write it down.
Yes, okay. So what is your view then? Well, two things I want to say. One thing, it seems to me that now that this ideology of Soviet communism is gone, that what seems to me that is replacing it is good old-fashioned Orthodox Christianity. And I just wonder if you would kind of agree with that. And it seems like Putin now is a Christian, and the ideological underpinnings of a lot of what he says has gone back to Christianity instead of the Soviet communist ideas.
Well, Russia is a multinational country, mostly, and that's why it's so kind of rich culturally. I don't know if you know, prior to the revolution, there was 15,000 churches in Russia. There was about 5,000 synagogues and about 3,000 mosques. So.
Well, it's multicultural, for sure. But I would like to say that they also have a problem in Russia, or in that whole part of the world, in Ukraine and so on. There's a lot of chauvinism, a lot of anti-Semitism. That's really there, and not in Putin. I think Putin is a very wise and sophisticated leader who's not that way at all. He understands that Russia is a multi-cultural country and so on. But there are a lot of people in Russia that need education, I would say.
Well, I think it's true for every country. I mean, anti-Semitism or racism exists in this country. Take a look, we haven't gone too far. About 40 years ago, we had the civil rights movement. It's just around the corner. It's 2 generations away. So, yes, sir.
I just wanted to say, I just found out today that there is no more communism within Russia, and that it's just like a Christian background on it, and that President Putin is Christian. I just wanted to say it really warms my heart, and I am going to get in touch with President Putin definitely. Now I can say freely, God bless you, Mr.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm sure there's lots of things that can be discussed. There's many things to be said. I must say, my grandparents were born in Russia, and my father was born in Poland, so I picked up some of the different strands of thought. Anyway, I don't know, Mindy, do you think can do?
Well, I think what we can do is we can see the other where we'll be at.
And we'll put you number 1 on the next spot. At least you can't say that we were dominated by men. Okay. So this will be a music. Well, let's do the 2 at the end, right?
Okay, we can get aboard and...
Yeah. Do the Ave. Okay. So we'll put the emphasis on the music here.
Okay. We're gonna sing 2 things going to do is the Ave Verum Corpus by Mozart. And since everybody doesn't have the words, it's in Latin, and I'll just read you the translation because I know not everybody got it. Not everybody has it. No. Hail, hail, true body, born of the Virgin Mary, truly having suffered sacrifice on the cross of behalf of man, whose pierced side trickled water and blood, be thou for us a foretaste in the test of death. And Mozart wrote this at the end of his life. And he was in a political struggle like we are today. And he wrote this actually for a children's chorus at the time. But he wrote it for all of humanity. And it's about the question of leadership that befalls every one of us in this room right now. Because there's a struggle when Christ died. Who was going to take up the leadership? And that's the question today, that we represent the leadership that exists. LaRouche path and the work of our movement over the last 40 years. So we're going to sing this for you now. by LaRouche, who you saw earlier in the program, who's dedicated her life to the ideas of nations fighting for the common aims of mankind, and the last 40 years for the land bridge. And she thought that the African American spiritual, Get on Board, Little Children, should be the musical spirit of the Eurasian land bridge. So what we've done is added a couple stanzas that are historically specific for the land bridge. We've also taken four languages for little children. One is, of course, English. The second is Russian, Malyevti. The third is Chinese, Xiaopingyu. And the fourth is Hindi, Chokobakche. So that's what you're going to hear in this spiritual, and we hope to do it justice.
Conferences around the country, including in California, as long as it exists. Whether the drought wipes it out, I don't know, but we'll, you know. So we're going to have more of these here in the Bay Area and across the country. Seattle actually had one today. We're going to report later. So I want to thank people for coming. The last thing I have to say is, as Debra and Leni said, we have pamphlets. We have to get them out here as well as across the country, and we have to reproduce them, which means we need money. You know, money, okay. I'm not a monetarist, but we need money. We have a lot of production and require a little distribution. So, and then you have the reports, which you can, I think we have a copy or two as a sample you can look at. And I would urge people to circulate the petition, be in touch with us. There are plenty of people who have websites, postings, organizations. This can go up and spread, okay? We're not that far from, as they say, going viral, all right? So thank you again for coming, and come next time and bring some friends.
It's been actually well over 40 years as exhibited in New York City. Because remember that when LaRouche said he started his He gave a series of classes at the New School of Social Research back in 1966. And during the period of the student unrest, 1967-68, was invited up to Columbia University, where he founded what was called the National Caucus of SDS labor committees. It was a labor committee within the student movement of SDS, intended to prevent what was then a potential racial confrontation in the city of New York, which was basically occurring around Columbia University's attempt to put a gymnasium in the middle of Morningside Park in Harlem. And whereas there were a lot of agitators and what we used to call back then proto-fascist elements in the student movement, in SDS, LaRouche intervened, saying students have only one interest, and that is not student interest. The interest is how can the United States as a whole adopt economic and social policies opposite to this deindustrialization and the destruction of the country that we saw in the Vietnam War, and that they should seek, but it was participatory, was because, as you know, there have been all these incidents around the country, whether it was Ferguson, Missouri incident, or the Trayvon Martin from earlier in Florida, or the Eric Garner incident here in Staten Island. And a lot of people are saying a lot of things about all of these, but the fundamental problem is that the causes, the true causes for these forms of social unrest are being ignored. Our job, of course, is to bring that into focus. There is a policy, a plan, to eliminate 6 billion people on the planet, and that includes a lot of Americans. The police, who are being castigated for their behavior in this regard, are not rich. The victims are not rich. If you look at the area at Ferguson, Missouri, this is a deindustrialized area, once a center of American production. And one thing I'd like to just point out is that in 2010, 4 years ago, the Chinese had a plan to actually expand the St. Louis International Airport, and we're in discussion and negotiation with the city of St. Louis to engage in a massive expansion, industrial expansion of that area. Unfortunately, many bankers from the city of London were also involved in that enterprise. And as a result, the policies that, for example, LaRouche is familiar with, been hearing some of it already, aren't what informed that effort. In Ferguson, Missouri, which is essentially a suburb of St. Louis, you have the Mississippi River that separates St. Louis on the one side and East St. Louis on the other. There's about 100,000 people in that area right now, primarily African American, who are employable and are not employed. The unemployment rate among those under 26 is now 75%. And so when you consider that the Chinese government 4 years ago was offering to be involved in that location, and that was not carried out because of the problem that we know exists in the White House, what we know exists in the form of the Cheney-Bush administration prior to that every instance of unrest in our nation today can actually be laid at the feet of the Obama and Bush-Cheney travesty. The Manhattan Project is merely a way, essentially, of taking Lyndon LaRouche's ideas and his policies.
All right, start.
That's a shadow now. Okay.
Ready?
Hey.
You ready to start? Can you hear me, Dennis? Can you hear me? Leona, can you hear me? All right, can we get Dennis to start? Yeah.
You were able to hear me, and I hope that that's true. But I also heard Phil say that he was expecting Dennis and Lynn Speed. So, bam! There's Lynn Speed waving. Okay, so we are both here, and I guess we're supposed to say something about what you've been called. Well, let me just say a couple things. We had today a what's called a sing-along. It's called that, but we had about 110 people approximately at a church, All Souls Church in the city here. Now, the reason we called it, and it was not a concert performance.
And at this point, we have, we're just changing the schedule slightly. So we have on, I guess, Google Hangout hookup or something like that. One of those computer-generated hookups. We have Dennis and Lynn Speed, who have been leading the work in New York, which is the main area of our present activity in the United States, or at least the exemplary area. That will be followed, and these are limited in time, we're just going to give you a taste of it, by Leona on the science driver. So let me just turn it over to Dennis and Lynn.
Okay, we're starting. Dennis? Yeah, we're ready. Hold on. Give 5 seconds.
All right, fine. No.
Oh yeah, sure.
All right, you guys are on.
We can't see you.
All right.
Okay, here we go.
Okay.